"Can you help us, sir?" The small voice cut through the howling wind like a blade through silence, and when Joaquin Redhawk looked up from cleaning his Winchester, he saw something that would shatter everything he thought he knew about the dead. The girl couldn't have been more than 7, her dark hair matted with dust and desperation, clutching an infant wrapped in what had once been a white blanket, but now bore the stains of 100 miles of running. Behind her stood a woman whose face would haunt him for the rest of his days, because he had buried that face 3 years ago in the sacred grounds of his ancestors, Arizona Territory, October 1887, where the Sonoran Desert stretched endlessly toward mountains that looked like sleeping giants, and where a Cahto warrior who had lost everything sat alone in an abandoned trading post. He believed that some wounds never heal, some losses never return, and some ghosts should stay buried. But the dead, it seemed, had other plans.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The wind had been Joaquin's only companion for months now, ever since he'd left the reservation. Lands of Northern California, and drifted south into this wasteland of sagebrush and broken dreams. He carried nothing but his rifle, his grandfather's war paint, and a heart that had turned to stone the day they told him Raven Moon Feather was dead. She had been everything to him once, back when the world still made sense, back when the Cahto people lived in the forests of Mendocino County, and the white man's wars seemed like distant thunder. That was before the soldiers came, before the forced march, before the disease that swept through the reservation camps like wildfire through dry grass. Raven had been pregnant when the fever took her, carrying their child in her belly when she drew her last breath in a military hospital tent while Joaquin held her burning hand and made promises to gods who had stopped listening. When they buried her in the cold ground beneath a wooden cross with her name spelled wrong, something inside him had died too. The white doctors had shaken their heads and spoken in clinical terms about complications and infections, while Joaquin sat beside her grave for 3 days and nights, waiting for her spirit to rise and tell him what he was supposed to do with the rest of his life. For 3 years he had wandered, a ghost haunting the spaces between worlds, taking work where he could find it. His reputation with a rifle preceded him through dusty frontier towns, where men whispered about the Indian who could put 6 bullets through a playing card at 50 yards, but who never smiled, never spoke unless spoken to, and never stayed anywhere long enough to call it home. He had tracked outlaws for bounty hunters, guided wagon trains through Apache territory, and fought in range wars where rich men paid poor men to die for their cattle. Each job was just another way to pass time until his own death came calling. The trading post had been abandoned for months when he claimed it, just 4 walls of adobe and a roof that leaked when the rains came. It was situated at a crossroads where the old Spanish Trail met the newer wagon routes heading west to California, and it suited him perfectly because it was a place where the living rarely ventured. The previous owner had been killed by bandits the spring before, and local superstition held that his ghost still walked the premises at midnight, rattling chains and moaning about his stolen gold. Joaquin had never seen the ghost, but he appreciated that the stories kept unwanted visitors away. Inside the trading post, dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that filtered through broken shutters, and the shelves that had once held goods for weary travelers now stood empty, except for spider webs and memories. Joaquin had made himself a simple camp in the back room, with his bedroll spread on the hard-packed earth floor and his few possessions arranged with military precision. Against one wall, a pot of coffee perpetually simmered over a small fire, and his rifle was never more than arm's reach away. It was a monk's existence, stripped of everything except the bare necessities of survival. He had been cleaning his Winchester for the 3rd time that day, a ritual that kept his hands busy while his mind wandered dark paths when the sound of approaching footsteps made him look up from the oiled steel and polished wood. The footsteps were light, uncertain. the kind made by someone who wasn't sure they wanted to be found. He expected to see another drifter looking for water or directions to the nearest town, maybe a prospector down on his luck, or a cowboy whose horse had thrown a shoe. He had learned to read people's intentions from the way they walked, and these footsteps spoke of desperation rather than mischief. Instead, he saw the girl. Luna stood in the doorway like a desert mirage, her small frame silhouetted against the blazing afternoon sun that turned her into a dark outline surrounded by golden fire. For a moment, Joaquin thought he might be losing his mind, because the child looked exactly like Raven had as a girl, with the same high cheekbones, the same enormous dark eyes, the same way of tilting her head when she was frightened. Her clothes were travel-worn and patched, her feet bare except for strips of cloth wrapped around them like makeshift moccasins, and she carried herself with the careful alertness of someone who had learned to watch for danger. "Please, sir," Luna whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind that rattled the loose boards of the trading post. "We've been walking for so long, and Mama won't wake up, and baby Rio is hungry, and I don't know what to do anymore." Her words tumbled out in a rush, as if she had been practicing them during the long walk across the desert, and there was something in her voice that reminded him of Raven's cadence, the musical quality that had first drawn his attention all those years ago. Behind her, partially hidden in the shadow of the building, stood a woman who made Joaquin's blood turn to ice water in his veins. Even though she was thinner than she had been, even though her face bore new scars and her clothes hung on her frame like burial shrouds, even though everything rational in his mind screamed that it was impossible, he knew that face. He had memorized every line and curve during the 2 years they had been lovers, had kissed those lips 1,000 times, had traced those cheekbones with his fingers while she slept. The woman swayed slightly on her feet as if she might collapse at any moment, and in her arms she carried an infant whose dark eyes seemed far too knowing for something so small. The woman was Raven Moonfeather, and she was supposed to be dead. Joaquin rose slowly from his seat by the window, his rifle forgotten in his lap as he stared at the impossible sight before him. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird trying to escape a cage, because the dead don't return, the buried don't rise, and yet here she stood. The rational part of his mind tried to find explanations. Perhaps this was someone who merely resembled Raven. Perhaps the desert heat was causing hallucinations. Perhaps he had finally lost his grip on sanity after 3 years of isolation and grief. But no stranger could wear Raven's face so perfectly, could move with her exact grace even in exhaustion, could carry the weight of suffering in precisely the way that she always had. "Raven?" he whispered, the name falling from his lips like a prayer to gods he had stopped believing in. When she looked up at the sound of her name, when their eyes met across the dusty floor of the abandoned trading post, the world tilted sideways and 3 years of careful numbness shattered like glass against stone. Her eyes were the same deep brown he remembered, but they held shadows now that spoke of horrors he could only imagine. There were new lines around them, carved by pain and sleepless nights, and a wariness that suggested she had learned to trust no one and nothing. She took a step forward, then another, moving like someone walking through deep water, and he could see now that she carried an infant against her chest. The baby was wrapped in a faded blue blanket that had seen better days, and tiny fingers emerged from the swaddling to grasp at the desert air. Luna stayed close to her side like a devoted guardian, watching Joaquin with a mixture of hope and terror that suggested she had been disappointed by adults before but was willing to risk hoping one more time. "Joaquin," Raven said, and her voice was exactly as he remembered it, like honey poured over gravel, like wind through pine trees, like every good thing he had ever lost. "I knew you would be here. I knew if I could just make it to the crossroads, you would be waiting." Her words carried the weight of absolute certainty, as if she had navigated across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. using nothing but faith that he would be exactly where she needed him to be. He wanted to run to her, to sweep her into.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
His arms and never let her go again, to demand explanations and apologies and promises that she would never leave him again. But something in her eyes stopped him cold, a wildness that spoke of horrors endured in battles fought in shadows. He realized that whatever had happened to her in the 3 years since her supposed death, it had changed her in ways that went deeper than scars. She held herself like someone who had learned that safety was always temporary, and that even love could be weaponized. "They told me you were dead," he said finally, his voice rough with disuse and emotion. "They buried you in the reservation cemetery. I was there. I threw dirt on your grave. The army chaplain said words over you in English and butchered your name when he tried to say it in Cahto." The memory of that day came flooding back with painful clarity. The crude wooden coffin, the hastily dug grave, the handful of mourners who had gathered to pay their respects to another victim of the white man's diseases. "They buried someone," Raven replied, shifting the infant to her other arm with practiced ease. "But it wasn't me. I was already gone. By then, already taken, already lost to everything I had ever known." Her voice carried a flatness that suggested she had learned to speak of her own tragedy as if it had happened to someone else, a survival mechanism that allowed her to function despite the weight of memory. Luna tugged at Raven's skirt, her young voice cutting through the tension like a knife. "Mama, is this really him? Is this really my papa?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a signal fire, and Joaquin felt the ground shift beneath his feet as implications crashed over him like a flood. The words hit Joaquin like a physical blow because Luna couldn't be his daughter, couldn't be the child Raven had been carrying when she died. That child had died with her, had been buried in the same grave beneath the same misspelled cross. Yet when he looked at the girl's face, when he saw the familiar curve of her nose and the determined set of her chin, he saw himself reflected back in ways that made his chest tight with possibility and terror. The child's stance, the way she protected the smaller baby even while seeking comfort from adults, the fierce intelligence in her dark eyes, all of it spoke of bloodlines that ran deeper than circumstance. "Your papa?" he repeated, looking from Luna to Raven and back again, trying to piece together a puzzle that seemed to have too many pieces and not enough picture. "But how is that possible if you died in childbirth?" His voice cracked on the last words, because saying them aloud brought back the pain of that terrible night when he had held Raven's hand while fever consumed her from within. "I didn't die," Raven said simply, and there was a weight of pain in those 3 words that spoke of stories yet untold, of suffering that had carved new lines around her eyes and new steel into her spine. "I was taken, stolen in the night by men who saw profit in a pregnant Indian woman, men who needed someone with my skills for their own dark purposes." She spoke with the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed this explanation, knowing that the truth was so outlandish it would require careful presentation. She moved closer to him now, close enough that he could smell the desert dust in her hair and see the exhaustion that hung on her like a second skin. When she spoke again, her voice dropped to barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might summon the demons that had been chasing her. "They needed a midwife, Joaquin. Someone who knew the old ways of bringing children into the world and keeping mothers alive through the birthing. They kept me in a place where the sun never shone and the walls wept with moisture, and when Luna was born, they let me keep her because a crying baby was useful for their work." "What work?" Joaquin asked, though part of him already knew the answer would be something that would make him want to reach for his rifle and ride hard toward whatever hell had held her captive. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, and he felt the familiar cold rage that had sustained him through the darkest days after her supposed death. "Selling women," Raven said, the words falling like stones into still water. Buying and selling women and children like cattle, moving them from place to place in wagons with false bottoms and cellars dug deep into the earth. I delivered their babies when they came too early from fear and trauma, and I closed their eyes when they died from despair. Her voice remained steady, but he could see the cost of these memories in the way her hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her hold on the infant. The baby in her arms stirred and made a small sound, and Raven looked down with the automatic tenderness of a mother who had learned to comfort her children in the darkest of places. Joaquin saw that the baby had Raven's eyes, but something else in the shape of his face that made him wonder about the father. The child was clearly younger than Luna, perhaps 6 months old, with the robust health that suggested he had been born into somewhat better circumstances than his sister, Rio, Raven said, following his gaze. His father was one of them, one of the men who bought and sold human flesh for profit, but he's gone now, dead by his own greed and violence, and Rio is innocent of his father's sins. There was something in her voice when she spoke of the baby's father that suggested his death had not been entirely natural, and Joaquin filed that information away for later consideration. Luna had been listening to this exchange with the solemn attention of a child who had learned too young that the world was full of dangers, and now she stepped forward and took Joaquin's hand in her small one. Her touch was like a spark that connected into a future he had never dared to imagine, warm and real and undeniably present. "Are you really my papa?" she asked again, and this time there was something in her voice that reminded him of Raven's stubbornness, of the way she had always demanded truth even when lies would have been easier. Joaquin knelt down to Luna's level, studying her face with the intensity of a man trying to read his own future in the features of a child. When he saw the small scar above her left eyebrow, the same scar he bore from a childhood accident involving his grandfather's hunting knife, when he noticed the way she favored her right foot just as he did from an old bullet wound, when he recognized his own stubborn chin in her determined expression, the last of his doubts crumbled like ancient walls. This child was his blood, his legacy, the future he had thought died with Raven in that hospital tent. "Yes," he said simply, the word carrying the weight of 3 lost years and 1,000 unanswered questions. "I am your papa, and I have been waiting for you without knowing I was waiting." The admission felt like stepping off a cliff into darkness, because accepting Luna as his daughter meant accepting that everything he had believed about the past 3 years was a lie. Luna threw her arms around his neck with the fierce joy of a child who had finally found the missing piece of her world, and over her head Joaquin met Raven's eyes. He saw there a mixture of relief and terror that told him their story was far from over. There were shadows moving behind her gaze, memories of horrors that would need to be exorcised, and dangers that had followed them across the desert like hunting wolves. "They're coming," Raven said quietly, her voice barely audible over Luna's excited chatter about finally meeting her papa. "The men who owned me, who think they still own me, they don't let their property walk away, and they have resources that stretch farther than you can imagine." Her eyes darted toward the windows, and he could see the hypervigilance of someone who had learned that safety was always an illusion. Joaquin stood slowly, Luna still clinging to his hand, and reached for his Winchester with the other. The familiar weight of the rifle brought him back to the present moment and the very real dangers that had followed his family across the desert. For the first time in 3 years, he had something to protect again, something worth killing for, something worth dying for. "Let them come," he said, and there was something in his voice that had not been there for 3 years, something that spoke of a man who had found his reason for living and would kill anyone who tried to take it away again. Outside, the wind continued to howl across the desert, carrying with it the scent of distant storms and the promise of rain. But inside the abandoned trading post, a family had been reborn from loss and love and the kind of determination that moves mountains. The dead had returned, impossible as it seemed, and Joaquin Redhawk was no longer a man with nothing left to lose. The first shot shattered the evening silence like thunder splitting stone, and Joaquin threw himself sideways as the bullet splintered the doorframe where his head had been a heartbeat before. Glass exploded from the trading post's only intact window, raining down like deadly snow as he rolled behind an overturned table that had seen better days. Luna screamed and Raven dove toward the back room, clutching baby Rio against her chest, while bullets chewed through the adobe walls like hungry termites through rotted wood. Joaquin Redhawk. The voice that bellowed across the desert twilight carried the authority of a man accustomed to having his orders followed without question. You have something that belongs to me, and I want it back. The accent was thick, European maybe, refined in the way that money could buy but breeding couldn't fake. This wasn't some frontier desperado looking to steal horses or rob travelers. This was something much more dangerous. Joaquin pressed himself against the wall and peered through a crack in the shutters, counting muzzle flashes in the gathering darkness. 6 men, maybe 7, positioned in a rough semicircle around the fun trading post with the practiced precision of soldiers or lawmen. They moved like professionals, covering each other's advance, using whatever cover the sparse desert landscape provided. Their horses were tied off 100 yards back, expensive animals that spoke of serious money behind this operation. Who are they? He called back to Raven, who had barricaded herself and the children behind a heavy wooden chest that had once held trade goods. Her face was pale in the dim light, but her hands were steady as she checked the loads in a small revolver she had produced from somewhere in her travel-stained clothes. The sight of her armed and ready to fight stirred something primal in Joaquin's chest, a fierce pride mixed with terror at what they were facing. Marcus Volkov, she replied, her voice tight with controlled fear. Russian nobleman who came west after some scandal back home, built an empire trading in things that shouldn't be traded. He owned the place where they kept me, where I learned that hell has many rooms and most of them are underground. She shifted, positioned to keep baby Rio quiet, rocking him with automatic maternal movements while her eyes never left the windows. He doesn't forgive, doesn't forget, and doesn't give up what he considers his property. Another volley of shots peppered the trading post, and Joaquin heard the distinctive whistle of a ricochet as lead bounced off the iron stove in the corner. These men knew how to shoot, knew how to lay down covering fire while their companions moved to better positions. This wasn't going to be a quick gunfight settled by superior marksmanship. This was going to be a siege, and sieges favored the side with more ammunition and better supplies. Papa. Luna's voice cut through the chaos, high and frightened but trying to be brave. There's a man by the water barrel. Joaquin spun toward the back window and saw a figure crouched low, working his way toward what had once been the trading post's rear entrance. The man moved with the fluid grace of someone comfortable with violence, and moonlight glinted off the blade of a knife held low and ready. Joaquin's Winchester spoke once, sharp and final, and the figure by the water barrel pitched forward into the dust. The man's knife spun away into darkness, and his expensive boots drummed briefly against the hard-packed earth before falling still. That's one, Joaquin muttered, already working the lever action to chamber another round. Luna, stay down and keep your eyes on baby Rio. Don't look at the windows. Don't look outside. Just watch your brother. She's not just watching her brother, Raven said grimly. She's been my lookout for 3 years, my early warning system. When the monsters came prowling, Luna knows more about staying alive than most grown men. There was pride in her voice mixed with the bitter knowledge that no child should have to develop such skills. The girl nodded seriously at her mother's words, positioning herself where she could see both the baby and the approaches to their makeshift fortress. The attack came from 3 directions at once, a coordinated assault that spoke of military training and careful planning. 2 men rushed the front entrance while another came through what remained of the side wall, and a fourth provided covering fire from behind a pile of rusted mining equipment 50 yards out. Joaquin met the first man through the door with a point-blank shot that lifted him off his feet and sent him tumbling back into the night. But the second man was already inside, a sawed-off shotgun in his hands. The shotgun boomed like cannon fire in the confined space, and Joaquin felt the wind of buckshot passing inches from his face as he dove sideways. The heavy wooden table he had been using for cover disintegrated under the blast, showering the room with splinters and iron hardware. He rolled, came up firing, and put 2 bullets center mass into the shooter before the man could reload. The would-be killer folded over his ruined middle and toppled forward, his expensive clothing now decorated with desert dust and spreading stains. The man coming through the side wall ran into Raven's pistol, and she proved that 3 years of captivity hadn't dulled her marksmanship. Her first shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around, and her second dropped him permanently. She worked the action of her revolver with practiced efficiency, checking her remaining ammunition with the cool calculation of someone who had learned to make every shot count. "How many bullets do you have left?" Joaquin asked as he reloaded his Winchester, fingers moving with the automatic precision of a man who had done this dance many times before. Outside, the surviving attackers had fallen back to regroup, and the temporary quiet felt ominous rather than reassuring. These men weren't giving up. They were just changing tactics. 3 in the pistol. Maybe a dozen more in my saddlebags if they didn't take them, Raven replied. "What about you?" Her voice was steady, but Joaquin could hear the underlying tension. They both knew the mathematics of gunfights. Ammunition was finite, mistakes were final, and reload times were when people died. "Full magazine. Maybe 30 rounds in my belt," he said, then paused as he caught sight of movement in the distance. "Raven, when you escaped from Volkov, did you kill anyone?" The question seemed to hang in the air like smoke, weighted with implications neither of them wanted to examine too closely. She was quiet for a long moment, her eyes fixed on something only she could see. "His lieutenant, a man named Dmitri, who thought he could take liberties because I was property instead of a person. I put my medical scissors through his eye while he was trying to force himself on me." Her voice carried no regret, only the flat certainty of someone who had done what was necessary to survive. "That's when I knew I had to run, because Volkov doesn't tolerate damage to his investments. Mama killed the bad man with the gold teeth," Luna added matter-of-factly, as if discussing the weather. "He tried to hurt her, and she made him stop forever. Then we had to leave in the middle of the night and walk for a very long time." The casual way the child spoke about violence and death was another reminder of the world Raven and her children had inhabited, a world where survival trumped innocence. A new voice called out from the darkness, this one with the crisp authority of someone accustomed to command. "Red Hawk, I am Marcus Volkov, and I have a proposition for you." The accent was definitely Russian, cultured and confident, in the way that spoke of education and breeding. "You have killed 4 of my men tonight, good men who were simply doing their jobs. This has become expensive for me. Should have thought of that before you came calling." Joaquin shouted back, his rifle trained on the sound of the voice. "These ladies are under my protection now, and your men drew first blood." He could see Volkov's silhouette against the starlight, a tall figure in a long coat who stood just outside effective rifle range. The man was either very confident or very stupid, and Joaquin suspected it was the former. "You misunderstand the situation," Volkov replied, his voice carrying easily across the desert air. "The woman is stolen property, taken from my establishment, without payment of debts owed. The children are part of that property, acquired through legal purchase agreements. I have documentation, properly notarized and witnessed." His words carried the smooth confidence of a man who had used legal technicalities to justify atrocities before. "Legal according to who?" Joaquin called back. "Last I checked, Arizona territory had laws against owning people." He was stalling. for time, trying to count the remaining attackers and figure out their positions. The desert night was full of shadows and deception, and men could be anywhere in the darkness beyond the trading post. Legal according to contracts signed and debts incurred, Volkov responded smoothly. The woman accepted employment in my organization, accepted housing and medical care for herself and her unborn child. When she defaulted on her obligations, she became indentured to work off her debt. Perfectly legal under territorial commerce laws. The man's ability to make slavery sound like a business transaction would have been impressive if it wasn't so thoroughly evil. Raven's face had gone white with rage, and when she spoke her voice carried the cold fury of someone who had endured too much and finally found her breaking point. Employment that involved being chained in a basement. Medical care that consisted of keeping me healthy enough to deliver other women's babies before they were sold. Housing in a cell that flooded every time it rained. Her words cracked like whips across the desert air. The terms of your employment were clearly explained, Volkov replied with infuriating calm. You chose to accept them rather than allow your unborn child to starve. That was a rational business decision, nothing more. Now you have cost me property and personnel, and I require compensation. His voice carried the patient tone of a teacher explaining simple concepts to a slow student. Baby Rio chose that moment to wake up and begin crying, his infant wails echoing through the trading post like an accusation against the world that had brought him into such circumstances. Raven immediately began trying to quiet him, but the damage was done. Volkov's men now knew exactly where they were positioned inside the building. Ah, the child lives, Volkov observed with satisfaction. I had wondered if the boy had survived the journey. He will be valuable once properly trained. Half-Russian blood commands premium prices in certain markets. The casual way he discussed selling an infant made Joaquin's trigger finger itch with the desire to put a bullet through the man's heart. Over my dead body, Joaquin snarled, and meant every word. He had found his family against impossible odds, had been granted a second chance at love and fatherhood that he had never expected. No amount of money or legal documentation was going to take that away from him again. That can certainly be arranged, Volkov replied cheerfully. I have 6 men left, all excellent marksmen, all experienced in this type of work. You have a woman, 2 children, and whatever ammunition you brought to this charming little fortress. The mathematics seemed clear. His confidence was maddening, but Joaquin had to admit the man had a point about the odds. Mathematics don't account for motivation, Raven called out, her voice carrying across the desert night like a war cry. You're fighting for money, we're fighting for family. Guess which one makes you harder to kill? She had positioned herself where she could cover the back entrance while keeping the children behind solid cover, her pistol steady in hands that had learned too young how to take a life. Volkov's laughter carried genuine amusement, as if he was enjoying the challenge they represented. Motivation is admirable, but ammunition is finite. How long can you hold out? How many shots do you have left? How many of my men can you kill before your luck runs out? His questions hung in the air like prophecies of doom. The answer came sooner than expected. 2 men rushed the front entrance while others laid down covering fire, and this time they came prepared for resistance. The first man through the door carried a shield made from an old wagon wheel, and the second had a bundle of dynamite with a burning fuse. Joaquin's shot punched through the wagon wheel, but didn't stop the man behind it, and suddenly the trading post was full of enemies and explosives. Get down! Joaquin roared, diving toward Raven and the children as the dynamite man lit his fuse. The bundle flew across the room in a lazy arc, trailing sparks like a falling star, and Joaquin had perhaps 3 seconds to get his family to safety before the world exploded around them. 3 seconds to prove that love was stronger than mathematics, that family was worth dying for, that some things couldn't be bought or sold or stolen. The trading post erupted in fire and thunder. adobe walls cracking like eggshells under the tremendous pressure of the explosion. Dust and debris filled the air like a choking fog. And somewhere in the chaos, baby Rio was crying, and Luna was calling for her parents, and Raven was shouting orders that Joaquin couldn't quite hear over the ringing in his ears. The explosion had blown a hole clean through the back wall of the trading post, and it was through this smoking breach that Joaquin carried his unconscious family into the desert night. Raven had taken a piece of flying adobe to the head during the blast, blood trickling from her scalp while Luna clung to his neck in terrified silence, and baby Rio wailed against the chaos that had become his world. Behind them, the trading post burned like a funeral pyre, casting dancing shadows across the sand as Volkov's remaining men picked through the rubble looking for bodies they would never find. Joaquin had discovered the tunnel system purely by accident 3 months ago, while Alkeen had discovered the tunnel system purely by accident 3 months ago, while digging a new well behind the building. What he had initially taken for a natural cave system turned out to be something far more interesting. A network of passages carved from the living rock by Spanish miners a century before, connecting the trading post to a series of hidden chambers that stretched for miles beneath the desert floor. The previous owner had either never known about the tunnels or had kept them secret for his own purposes. Now those forgotten passages offered the only hope of escape from the surface world where Volkov's men controlled every approach and exit. Joaquin had explored perhaps a quarter of the tunnel network during his months of solitude, mapping the safer routes and noting where cave-ins had blocked passages or where underground springs provided fresh water. It was rough going with an injured woman and 2 children, but it was infinitely preferable to facing professional killers in open ground. The entrance he had chosen was concealed behind a jumble of fallen rocks 200 yards from the burning trading post, invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. He had spent weeks moving stones and clearing debris to create a hidden doorway that appeared to be nothing more than another pile of desert rubble. Inside, the tunnel stretched into Stygian blackness, carved smooth by generations of flowing water and decorated with mineral deposits that gleamed like jewels in the light of his single candle. Raven stirred as he laid her gently on a blanket in the first chamber, her eyes fluttering open with the disoriented confusion of someone awakening from unconsciousness. "Where are we?" she whispered, her voice echoing strangely in the confined space. Above them, the sound of men shouting and horses moving filtered down through cracks in the stone ceiling. But here in the depths they were safe from immediate discovery. "Underground," Joaquin replied, checking the bandage he had wrapped around her head wound. "Spanish mining tunnels that connect to a whole network under the desert. I've been exploring them for months, and some of the passages run for miles in every direction." He kept his voice low, partly from caution and partly because the tunnels seemed to demand whispered conversations. Luna sat with baby Rio in her lap, rocking him gently while her wide eyes took in their subterranean refuge. "It's like the place where Mama and me lived before," she said softly, "except this one doesn't smell like fear and sadness." Her matter-of-fact acceptance of their underground sanctuary spoke volumes about the conditions she had endured during her short life. "This is different," Raven assured her daughter, struggling to sit up despite Joaquin's gentle pressure to remain still. "This is a hiding place, not a prison. We can leave whenever we want to." Her words carried the weight of someone who understood the crucial distinction between sanctuary and captivity. Above them, the sounds of searching grew more distant, as Volkov's men expanded their search perimeter, assuming their quarry had fled across the open desert. Joaquin had counted on this reaction. Most people thought in terms of horizontal escape routes rather than vertical ones. The tunnel system was their ace in the hole, a hidden advantage that might be enough to tip the odds in their favor. "How extensive are these passages?" Raven asked, accepting a cup of water from their limited supplies. Her head wound had stopped bleeding, But Joaquin could see the strain of their ordeal in the tightness around her eyes and the careful way she moved. Do they connect to anything useful, like other buildings or water sources? Better than that, Joaquin replied, spreading a rough map he had sketched during his explorations. There's a whole underground complex about 2 miles north of here, chambers that were used for ore processing and storage. Some of them still have equipment in them, tools and supplies left behind when the mine played out. He traced routes with his finger, showing her the safest passages and the ones to avoid. More importantly, he continued, there's an exit that comes up in a box canyon where the Spanish used to pen their mules. It's got water, grass for horses, and only one way in or out that can be easily defended. If we can reach it, we'll have a base of operations instead of just a hiding place. The canyon represented their best hope for turning from hunted prey into hunters themselves. Luna had been listening with the intense concentration of a child who understood that adult conversations often determined her immediate future. Will the bad men find us down here? She asked, her small hand protectively covering baby Rio's sleeping form. Her question went straight to the heart of their tactical situation. Not if we're careful, Joaquin assured her. These tunnels are like a maze, and most of them aren't marked on any maps. Even if Volkov's men find some of the entrances, they won't know which passages are safe and which ones lead to dead ends or cave-ins. He didn't mention the other dangers that lurked in the depths: unstable ceiling sections, underground pools of unknown depth, and the occasional rattlesnake that had made its home in the cool darkness. Raven studied his crude map with the intensity of someone whose life depended on understanding every detail. This route here, she said, pointing to a passage that curved away from their current location. Where does it lead? Her finger traced a path that seemed to double back toward the surface before plunging deeper into the earth. That's the interesting one, Joaquin replied. It connects to what I think was the main mining operation, a whole series of chambers and workshops carved right into the mountain. Some of the rooms still have furniture in them, tools, even a few weapons that the miners left behind when they abandoned the place. He had spent hours exploring those deeper passages, fascinated by the remnants of a lost enterprise. Weapons, Raven repeated thoughtfully. What kind of weapons? Her question carried the practical interest of someone who understood that their current arsenal might not be sufficient for what lay ahead. Between them they had Joaquin's Winchester, Raven's revolver, and perhaps 50 rounds of ammunition total. Old stuff mostly, Joaquin admitted. Black powder rifles, a few pistols, some mining explosives that might still be good if we're desperate enough to risk using them. There's also a forge down there, with enough coal and iron stock to make basic tools or repair weapons. The mining complex represented a treasure trove of resources if they could reach it safely. Baby Rio chose that moment to wake up and demand attention, his cries echoing through the stone chambers like an accusation against the adults who had brought him into such circumstances. Raven immediately began the eternal maternal dance of feeding and comforting, while Luna helped by making soft cooing sounds that seemed to calm her baby brother. We need to move, Joaquin said quietly, aware that even underground their voices might carry to unwanted ears. The deeper we go into the tunnel system, the safer we'll be, and the mining complex has supplies we're going to need. He began gathering their few possessions, checking his weapons and ammunition with the automatic precision of a man preparing for war. The journey through the tunnels was like traveling through the veins of some vast stone creature, passages winding and branching in patterns that defied easy navigation. Joaquin led with a single candle, its flickering light casting dancing shadows on walls carved smooth by centuries of flowing water. Behind him, Raven carried baby Rio while Luna walked with the sure-footed confidence of a child who had learned to adapt quickly to new environments. They passed through chambers filled with strange formations where mineral-rich water had created sculptures that looked almost alive in the candlelight. Some passages were wide enough for 3 people to walk abreast, while others narrowed to barely shoulder width, forcing them to move in single file. The air was cool and surprisingly fresh, suggesting hidden ventilation shafts that connected to the surface world. "Stop," Raven whispered suddenly, her hand touching Joaquin's shoulder. "Do you hear that?" They all froze, listening intently to the sounds that filtered through the stone around them. Somewhere in the distance, echoing through passages they couldn't see, came the sound of voices and footsteps. They found an entrance, Joaquin realized, his blood running cold. Volkov's men were more thorough than he had given them credit for, or perhaps they had local knowledge he didn't possess. Either way, their sanctuary had been compromised, and the hunt was moving underground. How many different routes are there to the mining complex? Raven asked, her voice tight with controlled urgency. She was thinking tactically now, weighing options and calculating odds with the cold precision of someone who had learned that panic was a luxury she couldn't afford. 3 that I know of, Joaquin replied, blowing out their candle and plunging them into absolute darkness. But one of them goes through a chamber where the ceiling collapsed last year, and another has a section that floods when there's been rain. Their options were narrowing rapidly, and the sound of pursuing voices was getting closer. Luna's small hand found his in the darkness, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so young. "I can see a little bit," she whispered. "In the dark place where they kept us, I learned to see without light. Maybe I can help." Her offer was both heartbreaking and practical. No child should have to develop such skills, but they might prove invaluable now. "Lead the way," Joaquin said softly, allowing the girl to guide them through passages she had never seen before, but somehow understood. Luna moved with the confidence of someone who trusted her other senses, her feet finding secure footing on surfaces that Joaquin couldn't even see. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew fainter as they took routes that their enemies hadn't discovered. The mining complex revealed itself gradually, first as a change in the air quality that suggested larger spaces ahead, then as a faint glow that might have been phosphorescent minerals or might have been artificial light. When they finally emerged into the main chamber, Joaquin relit their candle to reveal a space that took his breath away. The Spanish miners had carved a cathedral from the living rock, a vaulted chamber easily 100 feet across and 50 feet high. Stone pillars supported the ceiling, while carved niches held the remnants of religious statues that had watched over the work for centuries. Along the walls, tool racks still held pickaxes and shovels, while wooden tables bore the remains of equipment whose purpose could only be guessed at. "My God," Raven breathed, her voice filled with wonder despite their desperate circumstances. How long did it take them to build all this? The scale of the operation was staggering, representing years or perhaps decades of backbreaking labor in the darkness beneath the earth. "Long enough to leave us everything we need," Joaquin replied, moving toward a corner where he had discovered a cache of weapons during his previous explorations. Rifles, ammunition, even some of those mining charges I mentioned. He began checking the firearms, testing actions and examining bores to determine which weapons were still serviceable. Luna had discovered something that fascinated her even more than weapons, a collection of books left behind by some literate miner. Their leather bindings cracked with age, but their pages still readable. "Look, Mama," she called softly. Someone wrote down stories about treasure and dragons and brave knights. Her delight in finding books in such circumstances was a reminder of the childhood that circumstances had stolen from her. "Knowledge is the best treasure," Raven agreed, settling baby Rio in a makeshift crib fashioned from an old ore cart lined with blankets. "When this is over, you can read all the stories you want." Her words carried the desperate hope of a mother trying to promise her children a future that seemed increasingly uncertain. The sound of approaching voices echoed through the tunnels that led to their sanctuary, and Joaquin realized that their pursuers had found the correct route, despite the maze-like complexity of the passage system. "They're persistent," he admitted grimly. checking the loads in a rifle that had probably last been fired during the Mexican War. "Volkov doesn't accept failure," Raven replied, her own voice carrying the hard edge of someone preparing for battle. "He's built his empire on the principle that resistance is futile, that he always gets what he wants in the end. Letting us escape would damage his reputation, and reputation is everything in his business." She had found a serviceable revolver among the mining equipment and was loading it with cartridges from a box that had somehow survived decades of storage. "Then we change his reputation," Joaquin said firmly. "We make him the man who lost everything trying to reclaim property that was never his to begin with." He moved to the chamber's main entrance, a narrow passage that would force attackers to come at them one or two at a time. "Luna, take your brother and get behind those ore carts in the back corner. No matter what happens, you stay hidden until either Mama or I come to get you." The girl nodded solemnly, understanding that adult conflicts sometimes required children to become invisible. She gathered baby Rio with practiced efficiency, whispering soothing sounds that would keep him calm during whatever violence was about to unfold. Her competence in such matters was yet another reminder of the world she had been forced to inhabit. "Remember," Raven said quietly, taking position behind a stone pillar where she could cover the entrance while remaining partially protected. "We're not trying to kill them all. We just need to convince them that pursuing us costs more than it's worth." Her tactical thinking was sound, but Joaquin wondered if Volkov was the type of man who could be convinced by anything short of death. First figure appeared in the tunnel entrance, moving cautiously with a rifle held ready. Behind him, other shapes waited in the darkness, professional hunters who had tracked their prey through miles of underground passages. The final confrontation was about to begin in a cathedral carved from stone, where the echoes of gunfire would ring like prayers to violent gods. The first gunshot never came, because the man in the tunnel entrance wasn't holding a rifle at all, but rather a white cloth tied to the end of a mining pick, and his voice carried the careful neutrality of someone delivering a message rather than leading an attack. "Joaquin Redhawk, my employer wishes to speak with you under a flag of truce." The man called into the cathedral chamber, his words echoing off stone walls that had witnessed centuries of human ambition and suffering. Joaquin kept his Winchester trained on the entrance while his mind raced through possibilities, none of them particularly comforting. Volkov wasn't the type of man to offer truces unless he held cards that hadn't been played yet, and the fact that he was willing to negotiate suggested either supreme confidence or desperate circumstances. "What makes him think I'm interested in conversation?" Joaquin called back, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. "Because he has information about your woman's past that you're going to want to hear," the messenger replied, stepping fully into the chamber with his hands clearly visible and empty. He was a lean man in his 40s, dressed in the practical clothing of a frontier professional, with the careful movements of someone who had survived dangerous work by never taking unnecessary risks. Information about what really happened the night she was taken, and who was responsible. Raven's sharp intake of breath from behind her stone pillar told Joaquin that the messenger's words had struck a nerve, and when he glanced toward her position he saw that her face had gone pale with something that might have been fear or might have been recognition. "Don't listen to him," she whispered urgently. "Volkov is a master manipulator who uses truth like other men use lies, twisting facts until they serve his purposes." "Nevertheless," the messenger continued, apparently able to hear her whispered warnings, "my employer believes that once you understand the full circumstances of Miss Moonfather's situation, you will see the wisdom of reaching an accommodation that serves everyone's interests." His words carried the smooth confidence of a man delivering a well-rehearsed speech. "And what accommodation would that be?" Joaquin asked, though every instinct he possessed screamed that this was a trap. Wrapped in reasonable language, Volkov had proven himself willing to use explosives in overwhelming force. This sudden shift to diplomacy suggested either weakness or a different kind of strength entirely. The messenger smiled with the practiced charm of a professional negotiator. Mr. Volkov proposes a simple trade. Miss Moonfeather returns to his employ voluntarily, working off her remaining contractual obligations over a period of 5 years. And in exchange, you and the children are allowed to leave Arizona territory with sufficient funds to start a new life wherever you choose. The offer hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire, carrying messages that went far beyond the words themselves. 5 years, Raven repeated, her voice flat with suppressed emotion. 5 years of being his property, of delivering babies. For women who'll be sold like cattle, of pretending that slavery is just another form of employment contract. She stepped out from behind her pillar, her revolver held low but ready, her eyes fixed on the messenger with the intensity of someone weighing whether to shoot the bearer of bad news. The alternative, the messenger replied with infuriating calm, is that Mr. Volkov exercises his legal options through the territorial courts, which will almost certainly result in the children being placed in orphanages, while Miss Moonfeather serves time in prison for theft of valuable property. His threat was delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing weather patterns. Luna's small voice cut through the adult conversation like a knife through silk. "Mama, what's an orphanage?" The question came from the back corner, where she sat with baby Rio, her young mind trying to process concepts that no child should have to understand. The innocence in her voice made the messenger's threats seem even more obscene. "It's a place where children go when they don't have families to take care of them," Raven explained gently, though her words were directed at her daughter. Her eyes never left the messenger's face. "But that's not going to happen to you, because Mama isn't going anywhere without you and your brother." Her voice carried the absolute certainty of a woman who had made her choice regardless of the consequences. The messenger's expression shifted slightly, perhaps recognizing that he was dealing with someone who couldn't be intimidated by threats against her own welfare. "Mr. Volkov anticipated that response," he said carefully, "which is why he authorized me to share certain information that might change your perspective on the situation." He reached slowly into his coat pocket, producing a folded document with the careful movements of someone handling something dangerous. "What kind of information?" Joaquin demanded, though part of him already suspected that whatever Volkov had discovered would be the kind of truth that destroyed comfortable illusions. The Russian had proven himself to be thorough in his preparations, and men like that didn't make empty threats or meaningless gestures. The messenger unfolded the document with theatrical precision, holding it so that the candlelight revealed official seals and formal script. "A death certificate," he announced, "issued by the Territorial Medical Examiner 3 years ago, certifying that one Raven Moonfeather died of complications following childbirth at the reservation hospital." His words fell into the cathedral chamber like stones dropped into still water. "We already know about the fake death certificate," Joaquin said impatiently, though something in the messenger's tone suggested there were layers to this revelation that hadn't been explored yet. "That was part of the cover-up when Volkov's people took her from the hospital." The document itself proved nothing except that corruption extended into official channels. "Ah, but this isn't a fake," the messenger replied with satisfaction. "This is the real death certificate, the one filed by Dr. Samuel Morrison after he personally examined the body of the woman who died in that hospital bed." He paused for dramatic effect, clearly enjoying the confusion his words were causing. "The question, of course, is who exactly did die that night, and why was her body buried under Miss Moonfeather's name?" Raven had gone very still, her face draining of color as implications cascaded through her mind like dominoes falling in sequence. "That's impossible," she whispered, but her voice carried the uncertainty of someone whose carefully constructed understanding of events was beginning to crumble. "I was there. I remember being taken from the hospital. I remember the men who grabbed me. You remember being taken from somewhere." The messenger agreed smoothly. "But according to hospital records, you were never officially admitted as a patient." There's no record of your pregnancy, no record of your treatment, no record of your presence at all. He held up another document, this one bearing the official seal of the Territorial Medical Authority, which raises interesting questions about where you actually were when you gave birth to Luna. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by baby Rio's soft breathing and the distant sound of water dripping somewhere in the depths of the mining complex. Joaquin felt the world shifting beneath his feet as certainties he had taken for granted began to dissolve like salt in water. If Raven hadn't been at the hospital, if someone else had died in her place, then everything they thought they knew about the past 3 years was built on foundations of sand. "You're lying," Raven said finally, but her voice lacked conviction, and Joaquin could see doubt creeping into her eyes like poison through a wound. "This is just another one of Volkov's manipulations, another way to make me doubt my own memories and experiences." She was trying to convince herself as much as anyone else. The messenger produced yet another document, this one thick with official stamps and signatures. "Medical records from St. Catherine's Charity Hospital in Tucson," he announced, showing that a pregnant Indian woman matching your description was brought there by private carriage in October of 1884, suffering from what the attending physician diagnosed as severe mental distress and memory loss. His revelations were coming like hammer blows, each one designed to shatter another piece of accepted reality. "Mental distress," Joaquin repeated slowly, the implications of those words settling into his mind like lead weights. What kind of mental distress? He was beginning to understand that this conversation was heading toward revelations that would change everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. "The kind that results from witnessing traumatic events," the messenger replied with clinical detachment. According to Dr. Margaret Hayes, who treated the patient, the woman showed signs of severe psychological trauma, including memory gaps, hallucinations, and complete inability to recall events immediately preceding her arrival at the hospital. He was clearly enjoying the effect his words were having on his audience. Luna's voice cut through the growing tension like a child's cry in the night. "Mama, why is the man saying mean things about you?" Her question reminded everyone present that they were discussing adult horrors in the presence of children who didn't deserve to be exposed to such complexities. The innocence in her voice was like a light in the darkness. "Because some people use truth like a weapon," Raven replied, though her voice was shaking now with emotions she couldn't entirely suppress. "They take facts and twist them until they mean something different than what really happened." She was fighting to maintain her composure, but Joaquin could see the battle being waged behind her eyes. The messenger wasn't finished with his revelations. "The most interesting part of Dr. Hayes's records," he continued remorselessly, "is her notation that the patient appeared to believe she had recently given birth. DESPITE physical examination revealing no evidence of recent pregnancy or childbirth." His words hung in the air like an accusation waiting for a response. "That's impossible," Joaquin said firmly, looking at Luna with her unmistakably familiar features and then back at the messenger. "Luna is my daughter. Anyone can see the resemblance." But even as he spoke, doubt was beginning to creep into his mind like water through cracks in a dam. "Oh, Luna is definitely your daughter," the messenger agreed cheerfully. "But the question is whether Miss Moonfeather is actually her mother, or whether she's a traumatized woman who became convinced that someone else's child was her own." He was clearly savoring the confusion and distress his revelations were causing. Raven's revolver came up with sudden speed, its barrel pointing directly at the messenger's chest. "Stop," she said in a voice that carried 3 years of suppressed rage and pain. "Stop talking, stop lying, stop trying to make me doubt everything I know about my own life." Her finger was tight on the trigger, and Joaquin could see that she was balancing on the edge of violence. "The truth isn't always comfortable," the messenger replied, apparently unconcerned by the weapon aimed at his heart. "But it's still the truth. Mr. Volkov has spent considerable time and money investigating your background. Miss Moonfeather. And the picture that emerges is quite different from the one you've constructed for yourself. He reached into his pocket again, producing a small daguerreotype photograph. This, he said, holding up the image so they could all see it, is a photograph taken at St. Catherine's Hospital in November of 1884, showing a woman identified in the medical records as Jane Doe, suffering from severe psychological trauma. The photograph showed a woman who looked exactly like Raven, but her eyes held a wildness that spoke of madness rather than mere distress. And this, the messenger continued, producing another photograph, is a picture of the real Raven Moonfeather, taken from her personal effects after her death at the reservation hospital. The second image showed a woman who bore some resemblance to the Raven they knew, but whose features were subtly different, as if she were a sister rather than the same person. The cathedral chamber fell silent, except for the sound of Raven's ragged breathing and baby Rio's contented gurgling from his makeshift crib. Luna looked back and forth between the adults with the confusion of a child who sensed that something important was happening, but couldn't understand what it meant. The very foundations of their reality were shifting like sand in an earthquake. Even if any of this is true, Joaquin said finally, his voice carefully controlled, it doesn't change anything. This woman is the mother of my children, regardless of what name she was born with. He was trying to anchor himself to something solid in a world that suddenly seemed made of shifting illusions. But it changes everything legally. The messenger replied with satisfaction. You see, if this woman isn't actually Raven Moonfeather, then she has no legal claim to the children she's been caring for. Luna and baby Rio become wards of the territorial government, available for adoption by suitable families. His smile was the expression of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. Suitable families like Volkov, Raven said bitterly, understanding at last the full scope of the trap that had been laid for them. He doesn't just want me back. He wants the children too, and now he's found a legal way to take them. Her voice carried the defeated tone of someone who had fought too many battles against impossible odds. The messenger nodded approvingly, like a teacher whose student had finally grasped a difficult concept. Mr. Volkov has already filed the appropriate paperwork with the territorial authorities, he confirmed, claiming that he rescued the children from an unstable woman who had kidnapped them under the delusion that they were her own offspring. The legal trap was closing around them with the inexorable precision of a well-designed machine. So what exactly is Volkov's offer? Joaquin asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. The Russian had maneuvered them into a position where surrender was the only option that didn't result in losing everything they cared about. Simple, the messenger replied. Miss Moonfeather, or whoever she really is, returns to Mr. Volkov's employ for the agreed-upon 5 years. The children remain with you, with legal adoption papers properly filed and witnessed. Everyone gets what they want most. The offer was reasonable on its surface, which made it even more insidious. Except that Raven loses 5 years of her life to slavery, Joaquin pointed out, though he could see the trap closing around them with mechanical precision. 5 years of being property, of being used however Volkov sees fit. The choice being offered was no choice at all. 5 years in exchange for the children's future, the messenger corrected gently. 5 years of work in exchange for legal protection and financial security for the family she's claimed as her own. He was making slavery sound like a reasonable business transaction. Luna's voice cut through the adult negotiations like a sword through silk. I don't want Mama to go away again, she said firmly. And in those simple words lay the heart of everything they were fighting for. We just found Papa, and now we're supposed to be a family. Her childish certainty was like a beacon in the moral darkness. Luna's declaration shattered something fundamental in the cathedral chamber, and the messenger's confident smile faltered as he realized that his carefully orchestrated manipulation had just run headlong into the immovable force of a child's absolute faith in family. Raven looked at her daughter with eyes that blazed like fire in the candlelight. And when she spoke, her voice carried the cold finality of a woman who had just discovered exactly how far she was willing to go to protect what mattered most. Stone walls seemed to absorb her words and amplify them, turning her defiance into something that echoed through the depths like a war drum. "Tell your employer," Raven said to the messenger, her revolver never wavering from its target, "that he can take his legal documents and his adoption papers and his 5-year contracts and burn them all in hell where they belong." Her words echoed off the stone walls like a war cry, and Luna clapped her small hands together in approval of her mother's defiance. The sound sharp and decisive in the underground chamber, the messenger's expression shifted from confident superiority to something approaching concern as he realized that his psychological warfare had backfired spectacularly. He had clearly expected tears, pleading, perhaps desperate bargaining for better terms, but instead he was facing a woman who looked ready to paint the cavern walls with his blood. "You're making a serious mistake," he warned, but his voice lacked the smooth assurance it had carried moments before, cracking slightly on the final words. "Mr. Volkov has resources you can't imagine, legal connections that reach all the way to the territorial capital. You can't fight the law itself. Watch me," Raven replied simply, and there was something in her tone that made the messenger take an involuntary step backward, his expensive boots scraping against the stone floor. "I've spent 3 years being told what I can't do, what I can't remember, what I can't choose for myself. I'm done listening to men who think they own pieces of paper that make them gods." Her finger tightened on the trigger, and Joaquin could see murder in her eyes, a cold calculation that spoke of someone who had already counted the cost of violence and found it acceptable. "Wait," Joaquin said quietly, his hand touching Raven's arm with gentle pressure that somehow managed to convey both restraint and support. "Before we start killing messengers, there's something I want to know." He turned his attention to the man with the documents, studying him with the intensity of someone reading an opponent's tells in a high-stakes poker game. The messenger was well-dressed, well-fed, with the soft hands of someone who had never done manual labor, but his eyes held the wariness of a man who had delivered bad news before and lived to tell about it. "You said Volkov has legal connections, territorial authorities in his pocket," Joaquin continued, his voice conversational despite the tension crackling through the chamber like electricity before a thunderstorm. "What happens when those authorities suddenly disappear?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a signal fire, carrying implications that the messenger was only beginning to grasp. The messenger frowned, clearly not understanding where this line of questioning was heading, his confusion genuine enough to suggest that Volkov's briefing hadn't covered this particular scenario. "What do you mean, disappear?" he asked cautiously, perhaps sensing that the conversation had taken a turn he hadn't anticipated. "People in positions of authority don't just vanish, especially not territorial officials with federal backing. They do during Apache raids," Joaquin replied conversationally, and his words sent a chill through the chamber that had nothing to do with the underground location. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees as the implications of his statement began to sink in. "Funny thing about this part of Arizona territory, it's right on the edge of Apache hunting grounds, and those boys have been getting restless lately. Word is they're planning something big, something that's going to remind the white folks that this land wasn't always theirs." He spoke with the casual familiarity of someone discussing old friends rather than feared enemies. The messenger's face went pale as implications began to dawn on him, his earlier confidence evaporating like water in desert heat. "You're talking about savages attacking civilized settlements," he said, his voice rising slightly with what might have been fear or indignation. "That's not warfare, that's butchery, and the army will respond with overwhelming force. The territorial government has dealt with Indian uprisings before. The army will respond to what's left after the Apache are finished." Joaquin corrected with grim satisfaction, clearly enjoying the effect his words were having on Volkov's representative. But by then, Volkov's legal documents won't matter much, because the men who signed them will be decorating war poles, and the territorial offices where they were filed will be smoking ruins filled with nothing but ash and memories. He was painting a picture of chaos that would sweep away all of Volkov's careful legal preparations like a flash flood washing away a house of cards. Raven caught on immediately to what Joaquin was suggesting, and her smile was like winter sunlight on fresh snow, beautiful and utterly without warmth. "Of course," she said softly, her voice carrying the deadly sweetness of honey laced with poison. It would be terrible if someone were to tell the Apache exactly where to find those territorial officials, especially if that someone happened to speak their language and know their traditional grievances against the government. Her words carried the promise of violence wrapped in the velvet glove of hypothetical discussion. "You're talking about inciting genocide," the messenger protested. But his voice cracked on the words, and Joaquin could see sweat beading on his forehead, despite the cool underground air. The man was clearly beginning to understand that he was dealing with people who played by entirely different rules than the civilized society he represented. The authorities would hunt you down like animals if they suspected you were collaborating with hostile Indians. "What authorities?" Joaquin asked pleasantly, his tone as casual as if you were discussing the weather rather than the systematic destruction of territorial government. "The ones who'll be dead? The ones whose offices will be burned? The ones whose records will be scattered to the four winds like leaves in a hurricane?" He was clearly enjoying the effect his words were having on Volkov's representative, watching the man's composure crumble like a sandcastle at high tide. Luna had been listening to this exchange with the fascinated attention of a child discovering that adults could be far more ruthless than she had imagined, her dark eyes moving back and forth between the speakers like someone watching a tennis match. "Papa," she said thoughtfully, her small voice cutting through the adult conversation with the clarity of absolute innocence. "Are you really friends with the Apache?" Her question carried no fear, only curiosity about this new facet of her father's character. "Friends might be too strong a word," Joaquin replied honestly, kneeling down to Luna's level so they could speak eye to eye, his voice gentle when addressing his daughter despite the violent nature of their conversation. "But we understand each other. I fought alongside some of their warriors during the range wars, and I've never forgotten that this was their land long before any of us arrived." His words carried the weight of genuine respect, rather than mere tactical convenience, the acknowledgement of debts that went deeper than simple alliance. The messenger was clearly struggling to regain control of a situation that had slipped completely out of his grasp, like a man trying to hold water in his bare hands. "Mr. Volkov will never accept this," he said desperately, his earlier arrogance replaced by something approaching panic. "He's invested too much time and money in acquiring his assets to simply walk away because of threats about Indian raids. The man doesn't respond well to intimidation. Then maybe it's time Mr. Volkov learned about the concept of cutting his losses," Raven suggested with deceptive mildness, her voice carrying the same tone she might use to discuss the proper way to prepare tea. "He can write off his investment in me as a business expense and find some other woman to enslave. Or he can risk losing everything he's built when the territorial government collapses around his ears." She was offering him a choice between certain small loss and possible total destruction, wrapped in language that made it sound almost reasonable. Baby Rio chose that moment to wake up and begin fussing, his infant cries echoing through the cathedral chamber like a reminder of what they were really fighting for. The sound was pure and innocent, a stark contrast to the adult discussions of violence and revenge that had been filling the stone space. Luna immediately went to him, making soft cooing sounds that seemed to calm his distress, and the sight of the children caring for each other gave Joaquin a fierce surge of protective determination that burned in his chest like swallowed fire. "There's another option," the messenger said suddenly, his voice carrying the desperate tone of a man grasping at straws. searching for any possible solution that might salvage his mission and possibly his life. Mr. Volkov could be persuaded to accept financial compensation for his losses, a settlement that would allow everyone to walk away from this situation with dignity intact. He was clearly improvising now, abandoning his prepared script in favor of desperate negotiation. "How much money are we talking about?" Joaquin asked, though he suspected the answer would be far beyond anything they could possibly afford. Probably more than most frontier families saw in a decade of hard work. Volkov wasn't the type of man to accept token payments, and his idea of adequate compensation would probably involve sums that could buy small towns, complete with all their inhabitants. $50,000, the messenger replied promptly. And the number hung in the air like an impossible mountain that no one could ever hope to climb. That represents Mr. Volkov's initial investment, plus reasonable profit margins for his trouble and the inconvenience of having his property stolen. The sum was astronomical by any frontier standards, more money than most people could earn in several lifetimes of backbreaking labor. Raven laughed, but there was no humor in the sound, only bitter recognition of how completely impossible. The demand was the kind of laugh that came from someone who had just heard the punchline to a particularly cruel joke. $50,000, she repeated wonderingly, her voice filled with amazement at the sheer audacity of the figure. That's more money than most people see in a lifetime, and he wants it as compensation for not being allowed to own human beings. The sheer audacity of the demand was almost breathtaking in its scope. "It is a substantial sum," the messenger admitted, perhaps realizing that his negotiating position had just become even weaker, like a poker player who had just revealed that he was holding nothing but low cards. But Mr. Volkov is a reasonable man, and he might be willing to accept alternative forms of payment. His words suggested possibilities that Joaquin didn't want to explore, implications that went far beyond simple monetary transactions. What kind of alternative payment? Joaquin asked suspiciously, though part of him already suspected that Volkov's idea of alternatives would involve things that couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. Men like the Russian valued power and control more than mere money, collected influence and fear the way other men collected gold coins, information. The messenger replied carefully, the word falling into the chamber like a stone dropped into still water. Mr. Volkov has many business interests throughout the territory, and accurate intelligence about Apache movements and intentions would be extremely valuable to his operations. He was suggesting that Joaquin betray his connections with the native tribes in exchange for his family's freedom, trading honor for safety. "You want me to spy on the Apache," Joaquin said flatly, understanding immediately what was being asked of him, the full scope of the betrayal that was being proposed. "You want me to tell Volkov when and where they're planning to strike so he can warn his friends and protect his investments." The proposition was morally repugnant, but he had to admire its tactical cleverness, the way it would turn him into a weapon against his own allies. "Information flows both ways," the messenger pointed out with renewed confidence, apparently thinking he had found a weakness to exploit, a crack in Joaquin's moral armor that could be widened into surrender. "You could warn the Apache about military movements, help them avoid traps and ambushes, ensure that their raids are more successful." He was trying to make betrayal sound like a form of assistance, wrapping treachery in the language of mutual benefit. Luna looked up from where she was playing with baby Rio, her young face serious with concentration as she tried to follow the adult conversation that was determining her family's future. "Mama," she said thoughtfully, her innocent voice cutting through the tension like a knife through silk. "Why does the man want Papa to tell lies to his friends?" Her innocent question cut straight to the heart of what was being proposed, stripping away all the sophisticated justifications to reveal the ugly truth beneath. "Because some people think that friendship can be bought and sold like everything else," Raven replied, her voice gentle when speaking to her daughter but her eyes remaining fixed on the messenger with undisguised contempt. They don't understand that some things aren't for sale at any price. Her words carried the absolute certainty of someone who had learned the difference between things that matter and things that don't. The messenger was clearly growing frustrated with his inability to find leverage that would move these people toward compliance, like a master manipulator discovering that his usual tools were useless against opponents who refused to play by conventional rules. "You're being unrealistic," he said with a hint of his earlier arrogance returning. "Mr. Volkov always gets what he wants eventually, and the longer you resist, the higher the price becomes for everyone involved." His threat was delivered with the confidence of a man who had seen this pattern play out many times before. "Maybe," Joaquin admitted with deceptive calm, "but there's something your boss might not have considered in all his careful planning." He was clearly building toward some revelation that would change the entire dynamic of their conversation. And the messenger leaned forward despite himself, unable to resist the bait that was being dangled in front of him like a fish hook disguised as a worm. "And what would that be?" the messenger asked, probably against his better judgment, but unable to resist the bait that was being dangled in front of him. What factor could Mr. Volkov possibly have overlooked in his assessment of this situation? His voice carried a mixture of curiosity and dread, as if part of him already suspected that the answer would not be something he wanted to hear. Joaquin's smile was like a wolf's grin in the candlelight, all teeth and predatory satisfaction, the expression of a hunter who had finally maneuvered his prey into the perfect position for the killing strike. "He's assuming that we're planning to run away," he said softly, his words carrying more menace than any shout could have conveyed. "That we're going to keep hiding underground until he gets tired of chasing us and moves on to easier prey." His words carried implications that made the messenger's face go pale with dawning understanding. "You're not running," the messenger said slowly, as if the concept was too foreign for him to grasp immediately, his voice carrying the hollow tone of a man who suddenly realized that all his careful assumptions had been built on quicksand. "You're planning to fight, to take the offensive against Mr. Volkov's organization." The idea seemed to genuinely shock him, as if the possibility of resistance had never occurred to him in all his years of delivering ultimatums to terrified victims who had always chosen submission over defiance. "Fighting is what I do," Joaquin replied simply, his voice carrying the matter-of-fact certainty of a professional discussing his area of expertise. "It's what I've always done when something I care about is threatened, and I'm very good at it." There was no boasting in his voice, just the calm statement of fact that made the messenger's hands tremble slightly as he clutched his worthless documents like a drowning man grasping at driftwood. The sound of approaching footsteps echoed through the tunnels behind the messenger, multiple sets of boots moving with the practiced precision of men who had done this type of work before. Volkov himself appeared in the chamber entrance, flanked by 6 armed men whose weapons were already drawn and ready, their faces bearing the hard expressions of professional killers who had learned to view violence as just another business transaction. The Russian was exactly what Joaquin had expected: tall, expensively dressed, with the pale complexion of someone who spent his time in drawing rooms rather than under the desert sun. Volkov's appearance was that of a European aristocrat playing at being a frontier businessman, his expensive suit immaculate despite the underground journey, his silver hair perfectly groomed, his hands soft and manicured like those of a man who had never done honest work. But his eyes were the color of winter ice, and they fixed on Raven with the possessive intensity of a man looking at valuable property that had been temporarily misplaced. When he smiled, it was the expression of a predator that had finally cornered its prey after a long and tiresome hunt. "Enough of this theatrical nonsense," Volkov announced, his accented voice echoing through the cathedral chamber with the authority of someone accustomed to having his commands obeyed without question. "I have grown tired of negotiations and legal maneuvering, and all this tedious discussion of rights and freedoms. You will return what belongs to me, or I will take it by force." His words carried the cold finality of an executioner reading a death sentence to condemned prisoners. Raven stepped forward, placing herself between Volkov and the children with the instinctive courage of a mother protecting her young. Her revolver held steady despite the overwhelming odds they faced. "I belong to myself," she said firmly, her voice ringing through the stone chamber like a bell calling the faithful to worship. Luna and Rio belong to themselves. We are not property to be bought, sold, or stolen by men who think pieces of paper. Give them the right to own human souls. Her defiance seemed to fill the underground space with electric tension. "Property," Volkov repeated with amusement, as if the concept of human ownership was merely an interesting philosophical discussion, rather than the foundation of his evil empire. Such a quaint American notion, this idea that people cannot be owned like cattle or horses. In Russia, we understood that some individuals are simply too valuable to be allowed their freedom, too useful to be permitted the luxury of choice. His smile was the expression of a predator toying with prey before the final strike. Luna had been watching this exchange with the wide-eyed attention of a child witnessing adult cruelty for the first time, her small hands clutching baby Rio protectively while her young mind tried to process the casual evil being displayed before her. When she spoke, her voice carried the piercing clarity of absolute innocence cutting through layers of adult corruption and rationalization. "You're a bad man," she said to Volkov, her small chin lifted with the same stubborn courage that Joaquin recognized in himself. "Mama told me about bad men who try to hurt families, and you're one of them." Volkov's laugh was like ice cracking on a frozen lake, sharp and brittle and completely without warmth, the sound echoing off the stone walls, like the cries of damned souls. "Children should be seen and not heard," he observed, his cold eyes studying Luna with the calculating gaze of someone evaluating livestock at market. "Though I admit this one has spirit that will need to be broken. She will fetch an excellent price when properly trained and taught her place in the world." His casual discussion of selling a child made Joaquin's trigger finger itch with barely restrained violence. "Over my dead body," Joaquin snarled, his Winchester coming up with fluid precision to center on Volkov's chest, the movement so smooth and practiced that it seemed like a natural extension of his will rather than a deliberate action. The Russians' guards immediately raised their own weapons, creating a deadly standoff in the candlelit chamber, where one wrong move would result in everyone dying in a symphony of gunfire and blood that would paint the ancient walls red. "That can certainly be arranged," Volkov replied with infuriating calm, apparently unconcerned by the rifle pointed at his heart, his confidence suggesting either supreme arrogance or hidden advantages that hadn't yet been revealed. "Though I confess, I had hoped to resolve this matter with less bloodshed and more cooperation. Dead merchandise is considerably less valuable than living merchandise, and damaged goods fetch poor prices in any market." He spoke about human life with the detached interest of a businessman discussing inventory management. Baby Rio began crying again, his infant wails echoing through the chamber like an accusation against the world that had brought him into such circumstances, his innocent voice a stark reminder of what they were fighting to protect. The sound seemed to break something inside Raven, releasing 3 years of suppressed rage and pain that had been building like pressure in a steam boiler. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of testimony that had been waiting to be heard. "You want to know what really happened that night at the hospital?" she asked, her words directed at Volkov but loud enough for everyone in the chamber to hear, including his guards who were learning for the first time exactly what kind of man they served. "You want to know the truth about your legal documents and your property rights and your carefully constructed lies?" Her voice was growing stronger with each word, fed by the fury that had been building inside her. "I already know what happened," Volkov replied with supreme confidence, waving his hand dismissively as if her words were merely the ravings of a hysterical woman. "My men collected a valuable asset who had defaulted on her contractual obligations, and was attempting to flee without paying her debts. Nothing more complicated than a simple business transaction conducted according to established legal procedures. His casual dismissal of her suffering was like gasoline thrown on the fire of her anger. "Your men murdered a pregnant woman in that hospital bed," Raven continued, her voice growing stronger with each word as 3 years of suppressed truth finally found its voice. "They killed her and took me in her place, but not before forcing me to watch them smother her with a pillow while she begged for her unborn child's life." The truth spilled out of her like blood from an open vein, staining everything it touched. The chamber fell silent except for baby Rio's crying and the distant sound of water dripping somewhere in the tunnels, as if the very stones were weeping for the innocent life that had been lost. Even Volkov's guards seemed shocked by the casual brutality that Raven was describing, their weapons wavering slightly as they processed the implications of what they were hearing about their employers' methods. "The woman they killed was named Mary Littlefoot," Raven continued remorselessly, her voice carrying the weight of testimony that had been waiting 3 years to be heard by ears that might actually listen. She was 18 years old, married to a cavalry sergeant stationed at Fort Apache, and 6 months pregnant with their first child. "Your men killed her because she had seen too much, because she could identify the faces of the men who had been stealing women from the reservation hospital." Her words painted a picture of systematic murder disguised as medical care. Volkov's expression remained unchanged, his face a mask of aristocratic indifference. But Joaquin could see something flickering behind those cold eyes, perhaps the first hint that his carefully constructed narrative was beginning to crumble under the weight of inconvenient truths. "You were obviously traumatized by your experiences," he said smoothly, his voice carrying the practiced tone of a man who had gaslit victims before. "Trauma can cause the mind to create false memories, to imagine events that never occurred. It's a well-documented medical phenomenon." "I wasn't traumatized," Raven replied with deadly calm, her revolver steady in her hands despite the emotional storm raging inside her chest, like a hurricane made of memory and rage. "I was awake, I was conscious. I saw everything, heard everything, remembered everything with perfect clarity." She moved closer to Volkov, her weapon never wavering from its target. "I watched your men kill that innocent woman, and then I watched them forge documents to make it look like I had died instead of her. Furthermore," Raven continued, her voice gaining momentum like a runaway train carrying the cargo of justice long delayed, "I know the names of the other women they killed, the other families they destroyed, the other lives they stole to feed your appetite for human merchandise. Maria Gonzalez, taken from her wedding day and murdered when she tried to escape. Sarah Running Bear, killed after giving birth because her baby was more valuable without a troublesome mother. Elizabeth Chun, butchered when she tried to warn other women about what was happening." Luna had stopped playing with baby Rio and was now listening with the horrified fascination of a child discovering that the adult world contained monsters far worse than anything in fairy tales. Her young mind struggling to process the casual evil being discussed around her. "Mama," she whispered, her small voice cutting through the tension like a child's cry in the night. "Is that why we had to run away? Because the bad men killed someone?" Her innocent question cut through the tension like a sword through silk. "That's exactly why we had to run away," Raven confirmed, her voice gentle when speaking to her daughter, despite the violence crackling through the chamber like electricity before a thunderstorm. "Because the bad men thought they could kill anyone they wanted and take anyone they wanted, and no one would ever stop them or make them pay for their crimes." Her words carried the promise of justice long delayed but not forgotten. Volkov's composure finally cracked, his aristocratic mask slipping to reveal the monster that lurked beneath his civilized exterior like rot beneath fresh paint. "Enough of this sentimental nonsense," he snarled, his cultured accent becoming more pronounced as his control slipped and his true nature emerged. "You are my property, acquired through legal means and contractual obligations, and I will not be lectured about morality by stolen goods. His mask of civilization was falling away like paint peeling from a rotten wall. Legal means, Joaquin repeated with bitter amusement, his rifle never wavering from its target, despite the mounting tension in the chamber. Like forging death. Certificates and murdering pregnant women. Like bribing territorial officials and falsifying adoption papers. Your idea of legal would make the devil himself blush with shame and look for more honest work. His words carried the contempt of a man who had seen too much evil to be impressed by its latest incarnation. The standoff stretched on, weapons trained on weapons, each side waiting for the other to make the first move that would turn the cathedral chamber into a slaughterhouse where ancient stones would drink fresh blood. The tension was so thick it seemed to have physical weight, pressing down on everyone present, like the lid of a coffin slowly closing on the living. Then Luna did something that no one expected, something that would be remembered long after. The gun smoke cleared, and the dead were buried. She walked directly toward Volkov, her small feet making soft sounds on the stone floor, her dark eyes fixed on his face with the fearless curiosity of a child who had not yet learned that some adults were too dangerous to approach. "Mister," she said in her clear young voice, "why do you want to hurt my family?" Volkov looked down at the child with something that might have been confusion, as if he had never been directly confronted by one of his victims before, as if his carefully constructed worldview had no category for innocent questions that demanded honest answers. "I am not hurting anyone," he replied automatically, his voice carrying less conviction than it had moments before. "I am simply reclaiming property that belongs to me according to legal documents." But his words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "People aren't property," Luna said with the absolute certainty of a child stating an obvious truth that adults had somehow forgotten in their pursuit of wealth and power. "People are people. You can't own them like you own a horse or a wagon or a pretty dress." Her innocent wisdom seemed to fill the chamber with something that hadn't been there before. A clarity that cut through all the adult rationalizations and legal justifications like sunlight through fog. For just a moment, Volkov's cold mask slipped completely, revealing something that might have been shame or might have been the last vestige of whatever humanity he had once possessed before greed and power had corrupted his soul beyond redemption. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by renewed determination and barely controlled rage that burned in his eyes like hellfire. "Get away from me, child," he growled, his hand moving toward the pistol at his belt. That movement was all Joaquin needed. The tiny shift in posture that telegraphed violent intent as clearly as a written invitation to dance with death. His Winchester spoke with authority, the sound echoing through the chamber like thunder rolling down from mountain peaks. And Volkov's expensive coat suddenly sprouted a new decoration of red that spread across his chest like a blooming flower. The Russian staggered backward, his eyes wide with surprise, and something that might have been fear, or might have been the first recognition that evil action sometimes carried consequences. Chaos erupted in the chamber as Volkov's guards opened fire, their weapons spitting flame and death in the enclosed space, like dragons breathing destruction upon everything they touched. Joaquin dove sideways, rolling behind a stone pillar as bullets chipped fragments from the ancient walls that had stood for centuries only to become witness to this moment of reckoning. Raven grabbed both children and pulled them behind the relative safety of an overturned ore cart, her own revolver answering the guards' fire with deadly precision born of desperation and determination. The gunfight was brief, but vicious played out in a space where every shot echoed like cannon fire and muzzle flashes lit the chamber like lightning strikes, illuminating a storm-torn landscape. Smoke filled the air with the acrid scent of burned gunpowder, while lead flew like angry hornets, seeking flesh to sting. When the shooting finally stopped, 4 of Volkov's guards lay still on the stone floor, their expensive weapons useless in hands that would never pull another trigger. while the remaining two had fled back into the tunnels, presumably to bring reinforcements or simply to escape the carnage. Volkov himself was still alive, but barely. His expensive clothes, now soaked with blood as he leaned against the chamber wall like a broken doll discarded by a careless child. When he spoke, his voice was weak but still carried venom like a dying snake delivering one last bite. "You have won nothing," he gasped, blood flecking his lips with each labored word. "My organization stretches across the entire territory and beyond. They will hunt you to the ends of the earth and make you pay for this insult." His threat was delivered with the last of his strength.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.